Salem, Massachusetts, was a town that never fully escaped the shadows of its past. The narrow streets, lined with centuries-old houses, still whispered of the horrors that unfolded during the witch trials. Tourists flocked there, eager to catch a glimpse of the macabre history that the town had so carefully preserved. But for the residents, Salem was more than a curiosity. It was a place where the past and present were tightly interwoven, where the line between the living and the dead often blurred. Morgan arrived on a warm August afternoon. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets as she stepped off the bus, her long black coat trailing behind her. Her presence was unsettling, an aura of cold that seemed to ripple through the air despite the heat. She was a tall woman with sharp features and piercing green eyes that seemed to see right through you. Her hair, black as night, fell in waves down her back, and around her neck hung a pendant in the shape of a serpent, its emerald eyes glinting in the sunlight. The townspeople noticed her immediately. It wasn't just her appearance that caught their attention. It was the way she moved, with a grace that was almost unnatural. She didn't stumble over the uneven streets like the tourists did, nor did she pause to take in the sights. She walked with purpose, her steps confident and deliberate, as if she had been here before, as if she knew exactly where she was going, and maybe she did. She made her way through the town, the fog thickening around her as she went. By the time she reached her destination, a decrepit mansion on the outskirts of Salem, the fog had swallowed her entirely. The house had been abandoned for years, a relic of a bygone era, its windows boarded up and its once grand facade now crumbling with age. But Morgan saw potential in its decay. She pushed open the rusty gate, the sound echoing through the still air, and disappeared inside. Within hours, the town began to change. The first sign was the fog. It rolled in thick and heavy, far denser than usual, and refused to dissipate even as the sun climbed higher in the sky. It clung to the streets, wrapping around the houses and muffling the sounds of daily life. Birds, once a common sight in the town, now circled high above, never daring to land. It was as if an invisible barrier had been erected around Salem, separating it from the rest of the world. The townsfolk whispered about the new arrival. Morgan quickly became the subject of hushed conversations in coffee shops and around dinner tables. Who was she? What was she doing here? Some claimed she was just another eccentric artist, drawn to Salem by its dark history. But others weren't so sure. They spoke of the way she looked at you with eyes that seemed to know too much, of the way the air grew colder when she passed by. And then there were the animals, cats and dogs that had been loyal to their owners for years, suddenly grew skittish, refusing to leave their homes or howling at the night sky. But it wasn't until the first death that the town truly began to fear her. Jacob Hartman was a fisherman, born and raised in Salem. He had spent his entire life on the sea, battling the harsh New England weather and bringing in the day's catch. He was a big man with calloused hands and a booming laugh that could be heard from miles away. But when they found him, there was no laughter, only silence. Jacob was found dead in his living room, his body slumped in his favorite armchair. His face was twisted in terror, his eyes wide open, staring at something unseen. But it wasn't the look of fear that chilled the town to its core. It was the cause of death. Jacob had drowned, his lungs filled with seawater. There was no sign of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle. The only water in the house was the salty brine that pooled at Jacob's feet, soaking into the worn carpet. The police were baffled. The coroner's report confirmed that Jacob had died from drowning, but how was that possible? His house was miles from the ocean, and the windows and doors were locked from the inside. Theories circulated. Some said it was a freak accident, that Jacob had somehow inhaled seawater while on the docks and collapsed when he got home. But others, those who had seen the look in his eyes, whispered that it was something else, something unnatural. Samuel Carver was one of those people. He had lived in Salem all his life, and for as long as he could remember, he had been obsessed with the witch trials. He had spent years poring over old manuscripts, court records, and diaries, piecing together the events of that dark time. To him, the trials were more than just history. They were a puzzle, one that he was determined to solve. When he heard about Jacob Hartman, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. He had seen many strange things in his time, but this felt different. It felt deliberate. The night after Jacob's death, Samuel sat in his cluttered office, surrounded by stacks of papers and books, trying to make sense of it all. He couldn't stop thinking about the new woman in town, Morrigan. There was something about her that didn't sit right with him. He had seen her walking through town the day she arrived, and even from a distance he had felt the chill that seemed to radiate from her. Samuel leaned back in his chair, staring at the map of old Salem that hung on the wall in front of him. He traced the routes with his eyes, following the paths that the accused witches had once walked, from their homes to the courthouse to the gallows. He had always believed that the town's dark history was just that, history. But now, with Jacob's death and Morrigan's arrival, he wasn't so sure. As the fog thickened outside, Samuel felt a growing sense of unease. He couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was coming, something that had been set in motion the moment Morrigan stepped foot in Salem. He knew he had to find out more about her, to uncover her secrets before it was too late. But as he began his investigation, he couldn't have known just how deep those secrets went, or how much danger he was in. The town of Salem was changing, and Samuel Carver was about to find himself at the center of a nightmare that had been centuries in the making. Samuel Carver's fascination with Salem's dark past had always bordered on obsession. He was a man driven by a need to understand the events that had shaped his hometown, to uncover the truths buried beneath centuries of fear and superstition. The Salem witch trials were more than just a historical event to Samuel. They were a puzzle, a complex web of lies, paranoia, and human frailty that he was determined to unravel. But now, as strange events began to unfold in the town he knew so well, Samuel's obsession took on a new, urgent edge. The day after Jacob Hartman's death, Samuel locked himself in his office at the Salem Historical Society, surrounded by stacks of old manuscripts, court records, and yellowed maps. The room was cluttered, a testament to years of relentless research. Every inch of wall space was covered with charts, timelines, and photographs, each one a piece of the larger puzzle he was trying to solve. Samuel had always believed that if he could just find the right connection, the right clue, he could understand what really happened in 1692. But this was something different. This was happening now. Samuel sat at his desk, a single lamp casting a dim pool of light over the papers in front of him. He was studying the genealogies of the families who had lived in Salem since the 17th century, tracing their lineages back to the original accusers and accused. It was a task he had undertaken countless times before, but now it seemed more important than ever. There was a pattern here, he was certain of it, but it was just out of reach, like a word on the tip of his tongue. Morrigan. The name echoed in his mind, a dark and ominous presence that he couldn't ignore. From the moment she had arrived in Salem, Samuel had felt a strange pull towards her, a need to understand who she was and what she wanted. There was something about her that was deeply unsettling, something that didn't fit with the town's current reality. She wasn't just a visitor. She was something far more dangerous. Samuel reached for an old book, its leather cover worn and cracked with age. It was a compilation of court testimonies from the witch trials, a detailed record of the accusations, confessions, and executions that had taken place over 300 years ago. He flipped through the pages, scanning the names of the women who had been accused, looking for anything that might connect them to Morrigan. His eyes fell on a passage he had read many times before, but now it seemed to hold new significance. She stood before the court, unrepentant and cold, her eyes burning with a hatred that could not be quenched. She did not cry out as they condemned her, nor did she plead for mercy. Instead, she spoke a single word as they led her away, a word that has haunted those who heard it to this day. Morrigan. Samuel's heart quickened. The name was there, hidden in the annals of history. Could it be the same woman? It seemed impossible. No one could live for centuries. But the more he thought about it, the more he couldn't shake the feeling that there was a connection. Salem was a place where history never truly died, where the past lingered in every shadowed corner and cobblestone street. Perhaps in a town like this, time was more flexible, more malleable. He pushed the thought aside for now, focusing instead on the events that had been unfolding since Morrigan's arrival. The fisherman's drowning had been only the beginning. In the days that followed, more strange occurrences began to plague the town. Children who had been perfectly healthy suddenly fell ill, their fevered dreams filled with visions of fire and death. In the middle of the night, a series of fires broke out in the homes of those who could trace their lineage back to the original accusers. The flames consumed nothing but the old family portraits that hung in each house, leaving the rest of the homes untouched. Samuel spent hours piecing together the timeline of these events, mapping them against the historical records he knew so well. The parallels were undeniable. Each strange occurrence mirrored a key moment in the trials. Jacob Hartman's death coincided with the first execution, the children's illness with the initial accusations, the fires with the burning of effigies that had once taken place in Salem's streets. It was as if Morrigan was reenacting the trials, step by step, using the town's collective memory as her stage. But why? Samuel knew that history held power, but this was something different. Morrigan wasn't just drawing on the past, she was feeding on it, using the fear and guilt of Salem's residents as fuel for something far darker. The more he researched, the more Samuel became convinced that Morrigan was performing a ritual, one that required the reenactment of the trials to reach its conclusion. But what was the end game? What did she hope to achieve? The answer, he feared, lay in the town's forgotten history. Samuel scoured the oldest records he could find, looking for anything that might give him a clue to Morrigan's true intentions. He found references to dark rituals, ancient practices that had been brought over by the earliest settlers, but nothing that explained what was happening now. Time and again he returned to the name Morrigan, finding it in places where it didn't belong, as if she had been woven into the fabric of the town's history from the very beginning. As the days passed, Samuel's obsession deepened. He stopped sleeping, unable to tear himself away from his research. The more he uncovered, the more convinced he became that he was the only one who could stop Morrigan. But the deeper he delved into Salem's past, the more he realized how little he truly understood. He was searching for answers in a maze of half-truths and forgotten lore, and every turn seemed to lead him further into darkness. Late one night, as Samuel was poring over yet another ancient text, a sudden gust of wind rattled the windows of his office. He looked up, startled, but there was no storm, no sign of anything unusual outside. And yet the air felt charged with something he couldn't quite name. He glanced at the mirror on the wall, an old, cracked thing that had been there since he'd moved in. For a moment he thought he saw movement in the reflection, a shadow flickering just out of sight. But when he turned around, the room was empty. His heart raced as he stared into the mirror, his reflection distorted by the cracks in the glass. There was no mistaking it. Morrigan was watching him, her presence lingering in the periphery of his vision, always just beyond reach. She knew what he was doing, and she was letting him continue, as if daring him to uncover the truth. Samuel leaned back in his chair, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. He was close, so close to understanding what was happening. But with every step forward, the danger grew. He could feel it, a tightening around his chest, a whisper in the back of his mind that told him he was playing with forces far beyond his control. But he couldn't stop. He wouldn't stop. Morrigan had come to Salem for a reason, and Samuel was determined to find out what it was. The town's future, and perhaps its very soul, depended on it. And so, as the fog thickened outside and the shadows in his office grew longer, Samuel Carver plunged deeper into the mystery of Morrigan, unaware that with every answer he uncovered, he was drawing ever closer to the final, terrible truth. The air in Salem was thick with tension, a palpable fear that gripped the town in a suffocating embrace. Morrigan's power had grown with each passing day, feeding off the fear and guilt that simmered beneath the surface of the town's history. The fog had become a permanent fixture, cloaking the streets in a cold, damp shroud that seemed to absorb all light and sound. It was as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something, some final act that would either condemn it or offer a reprieve. But in their hearts, the townspeople knew there would be no reprieve. Samuel Carver had spent countless sleepless nights searching for a way to stop Morrigan. But now, as he sat alone in his office, he felt the weight of defeat pressing down on him. His desk was littered with papers, the remnants of his frantic research, but none of it mattered anymore. He was out of time. The final piece of Morrigan's ritual was about to fall into place, and he had failed to stop her. It had started with the mirrors. At first, it was just a few, small, unnoticed cracks that spiderwebbed across the glass. But soon, every mirror in town bore the same fractures, each one reflecting back a distorted, shadowy version of the person who stood before it. Then, one by one, they began to shatter. The sound was deafening, an ear-splitting chorus of breaking glass that echoed through the town. Shards littered the streets, glittering like malevolent stars under the dull gray sky. In the aftermath, the townspeople gathered in the streets, fear etched into every face. They whispered of the shattered mirrors, of the shadows that writhed within them before they broke, as if the reflections had taken on a life of their own. Some claimed to have seen figures in the broken glass, dark shapes that moved with a terrible purpose. Others spoke of whispers that came from the shards, voices that promised doom in a language no one could understand. But Samuel knew the truth. This was Morrigan's final act of power, the culmination of her ritual. His own mirror had shattered in the early hours of the morning, the sudden explosion of glass jolting him from his restless sleep. As he sat up in bed, heart pounding, he caught a glimpse of something in the reflection before it disintegrated. A figure, tall and cloaked in shadow, standing behind him. When he spun around, the room was empty, but the sensation of being watched lingered, chilling him to the bone. "It's almost over," she continued, stepping into the room. The door closed behind her with a soft click, sealing them both inside. The trials, the accusations, the fear, it's all coming to an end. And you, Samuel, you've played your part perfectly. He finally found his voice, though it was weak and trembling. "Why? Why are you doing this?" Morrigan tilted her head, regarding him with a mixture of pity and amusement. "You, of all people, should understand. Salem was built on fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of power that couldn't be controlled. That fear has lingered for centuries, festering, feeding the darkness beneath this town. I am that darkness, Samuel. I am the consequence of the sins of this town, the embodiment of the guilt that your ancestors tried so hard to bury. And now, it's time to collect." Samuel shook his head, refusing to accept her words. "You're wrong. We've moved past that. The witch trials were a mistake, a tragic chapter in our history, but it's over. You don't have to do this." Morrigan's smile was cold, devoid of any warmth. "You're still clinging to the past, Samuel, just like the rest of this town. That's why you could never stop me. You've spent your life studying the trials, trying to understand them, but you never realized that by doing so, you were keeping them alive, feeding them, feeding me." She raised her hand, and the temperature in the room dropped sharply. Samuel could see his breath fogging in the air, feel the cold seeping into his bones. The shards of glass on the floor began to tremble, vibrating with an unseen force. "This is the final act," Morrigan said softly. "The last piece of the ritual. The mirrors were the key, you see. Reflections of the soul, fractured and broken. By shattering them, I've shattered the barriers between this world and the next. Soon the souls of Salem will belong to me." Samuel's mind raced, grasping for anything that could stop her, but there was nothing. He had failed. The town would be lost, consumed by the very darkness that had haunted it for so long. But then, in the quietest corner of his mind, a thought emerged, a desperate, final gamble. "What if I'm willing to make a deal?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Morrigan paused, her eyes narrowing. "A deal?" Samuel forced himself to stand, despite the shaking in his legs. "You're right. Salem's history is full of fear and guilt, but it's also full of people who fought against that darkness, who refused to let it consume them. What if I offer you my soul in exchange for theirs?" Morrigan's smile widened, a predatory glint in her eyes. "You would give yourself to me knowing what I am?" "Yes," Samuel said, his voice stronger now. "If it means saving this town, then yes." For a moment, Morrigan said nothing, her gaze boring into his. Then, slowly, she lowered her hand, and the trembling glass shards stilled. "Very well," she said finally. "You have a deal, Samuel Carver. Your soul for the souls of Salem." Samuel closed his eyes, bracing himself for whatever was to come. He could feel the darkness closing in, wrapping around him like a shroud. But he held on to one thought, one final hope. That in sacrificing himself, he had done something to break the cycle, to end the nightmare that had gripped Salem for so long. The last thing he heard was Morrigan's voice, whispering in his ear, a promise and a curse all at once. "Your soul is mine, Samuel. But know this town will never be free. Fear and darkness will always find a way back." And then there was nothing but silence. The fog lifted from Salem the next morning, revealing a town that seemed at first glance unchanged. The broken mirrors were swept away, the shards of glass discarded. Life returned to a semblance of normalcy, but those who had lived through the events of the past weeks knew better. They carried the memory of shattered reflections, of whispers in the dark, and of the historian who had tried and failed to stop the inevitable. For years to come, the townsfolk would speak of Samuel Carver, the man who had given everything to save his town. But as time passed, his story, like so many others in Salem's history, would be forgotten, buried under layers of new fears and new tragedies. And deep in the heart of Salem, where the fog lingered just a little longer, where the shadows seemed just a little darker, Morrigan waited. The cycle was complete, but the hunger remained. She knew that one day Salem would call to her again. It was only a matter of time.